Good morning, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. This is Rich again, back for your first video blog of the day for Sunday, April 26, 2014, around 6:57 in the morning in Belleville, Massachusetts. Nice and sunny day, but cooler than average. Some news to report. The Baltimore Orioles beat the Boston Red Sox by the score of 5-4 in 10 innings. In the Stanley Cup playoffs, the Detroit Red Wings are up 3-2 against Tampa Bay Lightning, and the Flames and the Blackhawks advanced. In the NBA playoffs, the Milwaukee Bucks forced a Game 5 against the Bulls. The Golden State Warriors swept the New Orleans Pelicans, and the Grizzlies are up 3-0 against the Blazers. That's about it on the news. And now, my next video subject of the day, the first one, will be about the famous Boston Bruins versus Montreal Canadiens rivalry. This is probably the best rivalry in the NHL of all time. It's one of the greatest sports rivalries as well. And usually the Boston Bruins and the Montreal Canadiens always play in the Stanley Cup playoffs. They played 34 times in the Stanley Cup playoffs, but this year they're not going to be a Stanley Cup matchup between the Boston Bruins and the Montreal Canadiens because the Bruins did not even qualify. The first meeting of the Boston Bruins and the Montreal Canadiens happened on December 8th, 1924 in the regular season, and since then they have met 903 times in the regular season, and the Montreal Canadiens have a 345/2 wins, 271 losses, 103 ties, and 9 overtime losses or shootouts losses against the Bruins. And the Bruins habs rivalry has had so many great players over the years. The Boston Bruins had Eddie Shore, Milt Smith, Bobby Orr, Phil Esposito, Jerry Cheevers, Eddie Johnson, Ray Bohr, Cam Neely, Zdeno Chara, Patrice Bergeron, Milan Lucic has participated in this rivalry. For the Montreal Canadiens, it's Jacques Plante, Doug Harvey, Dickie Moore, Maurice Richard, Harry Morantz, Guy Lafleur, Guy Lapointe, Patrick Roy, Chris Nyland, Mike McPhee, Chris Chelios, Stefan Richter, Matt Naslin, PK Subban, Carey Price, and a whole host of other players. When the Bruins play against the Montreal Canadiens, it's like a Stanley Cup playoff game. It's like a Super Bowl game. It's all of them rolled into one. And the Bruins and the Canadiens play in the same division, the Atlantic Division. They've been division rivals for most of the time they were in the NHL, except the 20s when the Canadiens were in the Canadian Division, and from 1974 through 1982 when the Canadiens were in the Norris Division, while the Bruins were in the Adams Division. But they've been rivals ever since division rivals. Roughly, the Bruins have played the Canadiens 8 to as much as 14 times a year. And all of these games are pretty good, pretty competitive. Sometimes the Bruins get blown out. Sometimes the Bruins win and stuff. And this past year, the Bruins laid a goose egg against the Montreal Canadiens in the season series 4-0. There's some years that the Bruins dominate the Canadiens in the regular season. Sometimes the Canadiens dominate in the regular season series against the Bruins. A lot of the Bruins fans say they really want to beat Montreal because they're so passionate about Montreal, and it's vice versa with the Canadiens wanting to beat the Bruins and stuff like that. And the Bruins Canadiens have had some great fights over the years, like 2011 when the goaltenders Carey Price and Tim Thomas fought, which was pretty amazing and stuff like that. And everybody's always hoping for somehow the Boston Bruins and the Montreal Canadiens to meet in the playoff, which usually happens. 34 times they have met in Stanley Cup playoffs. That's the most times any team has faced each other in all the professional major sports. And usually the Canadiens win. The Canadiens have like a 25-9 series edge against the Boston Bruins, and for like a 5-year stretch during the playoffs from 1943 to 1988, when the Boston Bruins and the Montreal Canadiens met in the playoffs, Canadiens always won. 7 times the Montreal Canadiens and the Boston Bruins met for the Stanley Cup playoffs. The Montreal Canadiens have always won against Bruins for the Stanley Cup playoffs. That's the Bruins and Canadiens will never play for the Stanley Cup playoffs again unless if they reassign the playoff format in the NHL. And some of the Bruins Canadiens playoff series were amazing and heartbreaking, especially for Bruins fans. There was one in 1979, which is kind of infamous in this part of the New England area. In Game 7, it was the Canadiens against the Bruins for the right to go to the Stanley Cup Finals. It was the infamous too many men on the ice for the Boston Bruins. The Bruins held a lead late in the third period in Game 7, which if they won, they would have won to the Stanley Cup Finals and faced off against the New York Rangers, but they were called for too many men on the ice. It was a fatal mistake by Don Cherry, coach of the Bruins at the time. Canadiens scored a goal within like a minute left of the third period, and they score in overtime to go to the Stanley Cup Finals. That move cost Don Cherry his job as coach of the Boston Bruins. 1984 was another heartbreaker for the Boston Bruins because they had a very good regular season record, and the Canadiens had like one of the worst records they had to qualify for the playoffs. But a hot goaltender by the name of Steve Penny blanked the Bruins during the series, and the Bruins were disappointed because a lot of people thought they had a good team to make the Stanley Cup Finals that year. And 1988 was a good year for the Bruins because they finally beat the Demons, beat the Jinx. It was like the curse of the Bambino for the Red Sox being reversed. The Boston Bruins finally beat the Canadiens in the playoffs, which was pretty good. Awesome. Bruins went to the Stanley Cup Finals that year. And the Bruins took advantage of the playoff series against Canadiens, winning maybe in 1990, 1991, 1992, and 1994. They didn't win in 1989 against the Montreal Canadiens. But in the 2000s, it got reversed again. The Canadiens beat the Bruins in 2002. The Bruins were the number 1 seed in the Eastern Conference, but the Canadiens had the number 8 seed and had a hot goaltender, Jose Theodore, who was the MVP for the league that year, and he beat the Bruins, which was a disappointment for Bruins fans. 2004, the Bruins were up 3-1 against the Canadiens, and people were thinking they're going to easily beat the Canadiens, but the last 3 games the Canadiens warred back, and it was a very disappointing ending to a season where a lot of people were hoping for another Stanley Cup contenders for the Bruins. 2008, the Canadiens were up 3-1 against the Bruins in a playoff series, but the Bruins battled back to win Game 5, Game 6, and people were hoping the Bruins would beat the Canadiens in Game 7 at Montreal, but it was not meant to be. The Bruins have never came back from a 3-1 series deficit to win a Stanley Cup series, and they haven't done it since. And 2009, the Bruins swept the Canadiens out of the playoffs. First time since 1992 they did that. And 2011, Bruins and Canadiens had another great 7-game series. Bruins came down from 2-0 to win Game 7 in overtime against the Canadiens. That was the momentum they needed to win the 2011 Stanley Cup playoffs, the Cup. And 2014 was their last playoff meeting, the Boston Bruins against the Montreal Canadiens. And it was, both teams were it was a so-so series first 4 games. No team kind of had that sense of a momentum into Game 5 when the Boston Bruins beat the Canadiens at TD Garden. And a lot of people were saying, Bruins got it. They're going to close out Montreal in Game 6 at the Bell Center. But the Bruins laid a goose egg in Game 6 and 7. It seems their momentum for Game 5 they ran out of gas, and the Canadiens took advantage of it and won the series against the Bruins in 7 games. Very disappointing because the Bruins had the best record in the NHL that year, and they were the odds-on favorite to win the Stanley Cup. And I think it was disappointing, and the Bruins have not been the same since. And the Bruins, Canadiens, are going to play an outdoors game, the NHL Winter Classic 2016 at Foxborough Stadium. Gillette Stadium, January 1st, 2016. The game's going to be on NBC. I bet Bob Costas is going to be there. I would love to see Bob Costas call that game, but they give it to Mike Emmerich. But one of these days, I hope Bob Costas calls a hockey game for NBC. And I just can't wait to see a Bruins-Canadiens rivalry heat up, and Bruins win the season series this year. Maybe sweep the Canadiens in the season series. Who knows? But we will wait and see. But I miss the Bruins hockey right now. Bruins should be playing in the playoffs and stuff. It's sad because there's no Bruins playoffs for them this year. No Bruins-Canadiens playoff series this year, and it's disappointing. Well, that's about it on that. Be back later. 2 more video plugs, Facebook and YouTube. First one will be about LRTA Bus 5, which goes from Lowell Kennedy Center to Drum Hill Plaza in Chelmsford via Westford Street. And the third and final video blog of the night, professional wrestling manager James E. Cornette, famous for managing the Midnight Express and famous in the WWE for being the American spokesman for Yokozuna, who was the WWE champion. So he led a wrestler to the WWE championship. Have a good day, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. Bye now.